Bom dia a todos que estão nos acompanhando agora no YouTube. Nós vamos agora iniciar a primeira atividade do nosso evento. É com imenso prazer que eu gostaria de apresentar, convidar a nossa querida amiga, professora Paula Cobus, que é da Faculdade de Educação e também coordenadora do nosso grupo de pesquisa, o GECAL, Grupo de Estudos Críticos e Avançados em Linguagem. A professora Paula é realmente uma pessoa que nós temos um carinho muito grande pelo seu trabalho feito no nosso grupo de pesquisa e hoje irá apresentar nosso ilustre convidado, o professor Salico Comafã. Seja bem-vinda, Paula.
Olá, bom dia, queridos prezados participantes do segundo colóquio de Educação Internacional para o Sul Global. I will introduce in Portuguese and then in English. É uma honra e um grande privilégio estar aqui hoje na conferência de abertura deste evento tão importante para apresentar um dos acadêmicos mais renomados e inspiradores do mundo. Professor Salicoco Mafuene, da Universidade de Chicago, é uma figura notável no campo da linguística e dos estudos pós-coloniais, e tem dedicado sua vida ao estudo da decolonização do conhecimento. Ao abordar o tema Decolonizar o Conhecimento, o que desejo em nome do Sul Global, o professor Salicoco nos convida a refletir sobre como as línguas e os discursos são afetados pelo colonialismo e como a língua pode ser um meio poderoso de resistência e afirmação cultural. Seu trabalho pioneiro ilumina o caminho para uma abordagem mais inclusiva e justa da educação, onde a diversidade linguística e cultural é valorizada e integrada ao cerne do conhecimento. O professor Salicoco foi nomeado Cher Annuel Monde Francophone de Collège de France, no calendário acadêmico de 2023, e foi eleito como membro da Academia Americana de Artes e Ciências. Neste colóquio, nós temos a oportunidade de aprender com o professor Salicoco e com outros grandes pensadores comprometidos com a mudança. Ao olharmos para o Sul Global, reconhecemos seu potencial intelectual, suas contribuições valiosas para a humanidade e sua rica herança de sabedoria. Decolonizar o conhecimento é uma jornada que requer esforços contínuos e colaborativos. E o trabalho do professor Salicoco nos guia neste caminho. Portanto, convido todos vocês a abraçarem esse desafio, a ouvirem atentamente as palavras do professor Salicoco e a se engajarem ativamente nas discussões que se seguirão neste colóquio. Juntos, podemos construir uma educação para o Sul Global que seja verdadeiramente inclusiva, diversificada e empoderadora para todos os envolvidos. Agradeço a presença do professor Salicoco Mafuene e de todos vocês neste evento significativo. Que possamos colher frutos profundos desses debates e promover uma transformação positiva em nossas comunidades acadêmicas e além. Distinguished participants of the Second International Education Colloquium for the Global South, it is an honor and a privilege to stand before you today at the opening conference of this important event and introduce one of the most renowned and inspiring scholars in the world. Professor Salicoco Mafuene, from the University of Chicago, is a remarkable figure in the fields of linguistics and post-colonial studies, dedicating his life to the study of decolonizing knowledge. By addressing the theme, Decolonizing Knowledge, What I Wish For on the behalf of the Global South, Professor Salicoco challenges us to reflect on the urgent need to deconstruct the power structure and hegemonic narratives that still shape the production and dissemination of knowledge in our time. His groundbreaking work illuminates the path toward a more inclusive and just approach to education, where linguistics and cultural diversity are valued and integrated at the heart of knowledge. Sally Coco has been named the Chair Annuel Monde Francophone at the Collège de France for the 2023 academic year and has been elected as a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In this colloquium, we have the opportunity to learn from Professor Sally Coco and other thinkers committed to change. As we look to the Global South, we recognize its intellectual potential, valuable contributions to humanity, and rich heritage of wisdom. Decolonizing knowledge is a journey that requires continuous and collaborative efforts, and Professor Sally Coco's work guides us on this path. Therefore, I invite all of you to embrace this challenge, to listen to Professor Sally Coco's words, and to engage in the discussion that will follow in this colloquium. Together, we can build an education for the Global South that is truly inclusive, diverse, and empowering for all involved. I extend my gratitude to Professor Sally Coco Mafuene and to all of you for being part of this significant event. May we reap profound insights from these debates and foster positive transformation in our academic community and beyond. With you, Professor Sally Coco Mafuene.
Okay. Thank you very much, Paula, for this wonderful introduction. And thank you, Clever, for inviting me to speak to you. I'll share my screen. Okay. So, do you see the full screen now? Can somebody let me?
Perfect.
Yes. Okay, good. I heard you, Paula, talk about decolonizing knowledge. And what I'm doing today is focus on my ecological approach to the evolution of language and deal with our understanding of colonization and show to what extent colonization as a process is nothing new. That is, shouldn't be just seen in terms of Europeans colonizing the rest of the world, but in terms of humankind being in the process of migration since at least 80 to 50,000 years ago. And I'll give you a synopsis of what has happened since then. I'm having a problem navigating. My navigator is stuck.
Do you stop and start again?
I should try.
Okay.
So it's not moving.
No.
So I may have to change the display.
Have you tried pressing the enter?
Enter?
Yes.
Yeah, but it makes no difference.
Does the mouse work?
Yeah, I have to try another device. Just give me a moment, please.
Okay.
I'll use the remote pointer and see if it works.
Okay.
But this is the first time I experienced this frustration. No, it's stuck. It's not my. So
there's an alternative here. You can press the P, Shift P,
Shift E.
Shift.
No, I have. Something has happened. I have to see where somebody is giving me. I have to go back to the presenter mode in order for this. The other thing I can do is no.
Okay, we're seeing your screen.
You are seeing my screen, but I need to navigate.
A good option is that you do not present in full screen, and then we can see, and I think it work.
Yes, but right now I don't see where I can select that option. So I had two images here. Okay. Okay.
Okay.
This is the one that will work, unfortunately. Yes.
Yes, it's perfect.
So
thank you.
The late Cavalli Sforza and his wife published a book in 1995 talking about the human population being a population in migration, and characterized the world population as the great diaspora. And that had to do with the dispersal of Homo sapiens out of Africa since 80 to 50,000 years ago. And at that point, we should be asking, when people migrated out of Africa, did they speak one language or several languages? So in evolutionary linguistics or evolutionary theory in general, that question is framed as monogenesis, that is starting just with one language, or polygenesis, several languages. And the question is, when we look, can you see my pointer? No.
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah. So when we look at the map of Africa and we look at the areas marked in red, and that is where fossils of Homo sapiens have been found. And the recent scholarship has shown that there are also fossils of Homo sapiens, of early Homo sapiens in North Africa. Given the size of Africa, and given the means of locomotion 80,000 years ago or 200,000 years ago, when we think that Homo sapiens emerged, how likely is it that there would have been only one language? Or is it very likely that different specimens of Homo sapiens, different colonies of Homo sapiens in different parts of Africa, developed their languages, respective languages, and those languages wouldn't be mutually intelligible and they wouldn't be structured in identical ways? I showed the picture of William Wang here because he's the person that suggested for the first time that we may not all have started with one language, but with several at the same time. So we are all part of a human diaspora that dispersed out of, within, and back to Africa since 80 to 50,000 years ago. The actual dates are still debatable. And language as an abstraction from the different languages that we have evolved was born in Africa. And it was born probably 300,000 years ago, 200,000 years ago. Nobody knows for sure. There are people that suggest that it might even be later. That is quite unlikely. And it is unlikely that we started just with one language. As I showed, Africa is so big, and given the different places where fossils of Homo sapiens, early Homo sapiens have been found, that we would have just started with one language. So polygenesis is the null hypothesis, but the number of languages must not have been as large as today, although we are now concerned with the endangerment of languages and language death. And some people have been speculating that the number of languages has been decreasing. Well, when you do language phylogeny and genetic linguistics in general, the picture that you get is actually different, that the number of languages may have been increasing. And the question that we should be asking is, what is the balance sheet of births and deaths of languages? So like in economics, the balance sheet of gains and losses. Our ancestors must not have migrated out of, within, and back to Africa all at the same time. That leads to the conclusion that the dispersal of Homo sapiens in so many different layers has also produced layers of mutual colonization, which has become evident from imperial expansions in antiquity. So what we see here are two maps, one showing how we, Homo sapiens, exited Africa. But at the same time, more recently, some parts of people that migrated out of Africa have been returning to Africa or returned to Africa. And we see that with the family of languages called Afro-Asiatic, and they may have returned to Africa about 3,000 years ago. The other question is whether we all left Africa and then some of us came back, or is it that some of us left Africa and other people migrated to the west side of Africa? And these are some of the questions that we have to ask. This sets up the kind of backdrop for talking about colonization. So one of the things I'm going to show, for instance, is that 80 to 50,000 years ago, the Bantu language family may not have existed at all, but there were migrations westward, and it's about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, there is a position at the border of Nigeria and Cameroon where we can speak of homeland of the Bantu populations, and they dispersed throughout Southern Africa. And later on, I will show you what are the populations that the Bantu people dispersed. And we look at the history of the world, we also see that China, for instance, is the outcome of several layers of migrations. The Semitic populations migrated where there were pre-Semitic populations, and little by little, Chinese has been replacing the more indigenous languages of the area. And now we are talking about the spread of Mandarin, which is in competition with other Semitic language varieties, but also with non-Semitic languages such as Tibetan, such as Uyghur, and so forth. But something is also curious, because at some point China was colonized by the Mongols and the Manchus, and what are the consequences of those periods of colonization. This is, again, to bring up an important question, that some populations may colonize other populations, but the outcomes are not always the same. For instance, the French, Norman French colonized England in the 11th century, and they kept it as a colony for about 3 centuries. But as far as we know, English has been influenced by French, but English has not been displaced by French. What we see is that the French actually assimilated to the indigenous populations and became the speakers of English. And now we talk about the great vowel shift that that appears to have been a consequence of the contact of English with Norman French, but there are other things to talk about. Later on in that history, we can also see that according to the received view in linguistics, and this is now being questioned, that the Proto-Indo-European people dispersed in different directions. But they didn't disperse really like members of an army where a general will tell a subgroup, you go west, another subgroup, you go north, and another subgroup, you go east. What we see actually is that Proto-Indo-European dispersed on the model of a cluster bomb with secondary points of dispersal. That what actually happened is at some point the Celtic populations had preceded everybody else during the Indo-European dispersal. And then would come, for instance, the Hellenic Empire, and then also later on the Roman Empire. But we also see that the Hellenic Empire didn't displace languages, whereas the Roman Empire displaced languages. And this is also very interesting because Latin displaced the Celtic languages only in the western part, up to Romania, but not in the eastern part. And yet, when the Roman Empire collapsed, it was only the Western Empire that collapsed in the 5th century, but not the Eastern Empire, which survived up to the 15th century. Here is a map that shows how things proceeded. About 10,000 years before our era, there were prehistoric people that migrated to England. And then about 500 years before the Christian era, the Celts started dispersing to England. And then in the 1st century of our era, the Romans started conquering England. They dispersed. And by the 5th century, the Western Empire, Roman Empire was collapsing, and the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jews colonized England. What is interesting is that 2 centuries later, Old English was born. But not late, much longer after that, the Vikings also colonized England. And then people talk about the Danelaw in England, which influenced English. And then in the 11th century, the Norman French colonized England, and then we speak of the great vowel shift and so forth. The point here is that the whole history of mankind, as I will show, consists of layers of territorial, layers of migrations and some migrations resulted in colonization. And we shouldn't be talking about colonization as a uniform process, but as a diverse process which has had different consequences. Revolution in genetics over the past 2 decades, beyond Cavalli's Sforza, is prompting us to revisit evolutionary linguistics from a language contact perspective. And what we learn is that for people that follow the dispersal of genes, the migrations may not have been in the ways that we always thought about them. In the previous map here, I show these Proto-Indo-Europeans dispersing in straight lines, and also show that the Indo-Iranian populations came from Anatolia and went to where Iran and India are today. But genetics is suggesting a different kind of story, that Proto-Indo-Europeans may not have been as unified a population as we thought. That Proto-Indo-European may have been the outcome of language contacts, populations that had migrated to Europe earlier, and populations that had already existed in India and in Iran, and the movements of the Yamnaya population about 2,000 years before Christ. And at some point, the people from Asia were migrating west and northwest, and the people from Europe, some of them were migrating to the south, and they met in Anatolia. So these are the kinds of things that we have to revisit. So, and in the meantime, we also know that where the Proto-Indo-Europeans went, there had been other populations before them, and language contact must have played an important role in the speciation of Proto-Indo-Europeans. So the differentiation of Proto-Indo-European into modern Indo-European languages is not a simple fact of Proto-Indo-European splitting into different varieties. It's also a matter of who the Proto-Indo-Europeans came in contact with, what kinds of relations they had with them, and what followed. And the rest, what I'm going to show in the rest of this presentation is a process known as differential evolution. The same populations moving in different directions and yet not doing exactly the same thing. I already told you about the fact that the Roman Empire split between the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire, and the Romance languages roughly developed in the Western Roman Empire, but not in the Eastern Roman Empire. And what is also more interesting is that the Romance, England didn't produce the Romance, any Romance languages. So this is something that we have to think hard about. These are the kinds of things that, from a uniformitarian perspective, should help us better understand what happened in the later wave of Indo-European dispersal out of Europe since the 15th century. Here, the Mediterranean has functioned in many ways as a kind of trade highway. So it starts with the Phoenicians, the dark mark here, who traded around the Mediterranean. Then the Phoenicians were replaced by the Greeks, the blue lines, and they also used more or less the same areas where the Phoenicians had been, but even went farther than that. And then later on, the Romans replaced the Greeks and built a very big empire around the Mediterranean. But what is interesting is that the Roman colonization produced the Romance languages, whereas, at least in the western part of Europe, whereas a Greek colonization didn't produce a significant family of Hellenic languages. So where is the difference? These are the kinds of things for which people have not given us any explanations yet that we can really accept. But these are the kinds of things that we have to investigate further. For instance, we know that during the Roman colonization, the Romans allowed the rulers of the territories that into which they expanded to become Roman citizens. They allowed them to compete for offices in the Senate in Rome, and some of them became emperors too, like the Emperor Hadrian, who came from Spain. These are the kinds of things that we have to bear in mind. So what would be the consequences of this is that the Romanized rulers shifted to Latin. They Romanized, they accepted Roman culture. And even after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, they kept the language, they kept the culture, and these are the kinds of things that would lead to the emergence of the Romance languages. Little by little, the economic success of the Roman style culture would help spread Latin, and not the standard variety, but vulgar Latin, to be embraced as the language of work, as the language of the economy, and little by little from the urban centers, Latin would spread to the rural areas and so forth, to a point where by the 20th century, France becomes fully Francophone, and in Iberia, we see different varieties, Castilian, Catalan, and so forth, that are in competition with each other. But by the 15th century, the Eastern Roman Empire had collapsed. Here come the Ottomans, and they built the empire. And just like before, they built it just where previous empires had coexisted already. Okay, but what is also interesting is that Turkish didn't become the language of the Ottoman Empire. What kind of colonization was this? We still need to understand. So the rest, if you have noticed, I speak of empires and colonization, just to highlight the fact that although the labels are different, the general process of relocation into a new territory and ruling that new territory or exploiting that new territory is the same, although there are specificities that vary from one colonizing population to another colonizing population. And here is a list of the questions that I articulated already. Why did the Romance languages emerge only in the Western Empire, but not in the Eastern Empire? Why didn't England become a Romance territory? And we have some answers to this, that in the Eastern Empire, the Romans still revered Greek, and they actually used Greek as the language of prestige, as the language of the administration. So you can colonize a territory and not necessarily impose your language. In the case of England, when the Germanic populations colonized England, they brought their languages with them, and they set up the kind of administration that eventually would displace the Celtic, not only the Celtic languages, but Latin itself. As I pointed out before, Old English actually survived several layers of colonization by the Scandinavian populations, and also by the French Normans. Okay, and so all along we can ask, why didn't ancient Greek speciate into Hellenic languages in a way comparable to the Romance languages? Why didn't the Ottoman Empire spread Turkish? And yet the Ottoman Empire did contribute to the spread of Islam. Okay. So in the 7th century, we get another wave of Muslim dispersal, the dispersal of Arabs from the Arabian Peninsula, present day. Anyway, I can't remember. So from the Arabian Peninsula, and they go into Africa, and they go all the way into Iberia. They arrive in Iberia quite quick in the 7th century, and within a year they had conquered the whole territory of Iberia. Yeah, so here I was thinking of Saudi Arabia. They conquered it, and they colonized Iberia for 7 centuries. And for 7 centuries, in different parts of Iberia, Arabic became the language of scholarship. Arabic became the language of administration. Arabic became the language of economy. And for a while, Arabic put Latin in a recession. And yet, after the Arabs were driven out of Iberia through the Reconquista, Arabic also disappeared as an important language in Iberia, and Neo-Latin varieties came back. So, but Arabic did influence the way in which the Neo-Latin varieties would evolve. This is where we can speak of what is known as abstract influence. So we cannot account for the speciation of Vulgar Latin into so many Romance languages without factoring in the influence of the earlier populations identified as the substrate populations, and without the influence of other populations that came with them, in this case, the Muslims that exerted what we call superstrate influence, or abstract influence in some ways. Okay, but what we also see is that although Arabic didn't survive in Iberia as an important language after the 15th century, in North Africa, it really became entrenched. In North Africa, Arabic became an important vernacular that was in competition with indigenous languages like Berber. And what has happened is that the settlement colonization of North Africa had an impact on the vitality of the more indigenous languages in the region. And now the more indigenous languages, many of them are endangered. Okay. So that means we have to see whether, first of all, the Arabs and the Moors colonized Iberia in the same way as they colonized Africa. And what are the differences in the styles of communication that have such differing outcomes between Iberia and North Africa? So colonization is definitely not a uniform process. There are diverse styles of colonization that have produced different population structures and dynamics of language coexistence, and that is what I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. The last half millennium of human history produced the last wave of Indo-European dispersal and has taught us to distinguish settler colonies from trade colonies and exploitation colonies. Settler colonies like in the Americas and Australia, and trade colonies on the coast of Africa and Asia, and exploitation colonies since the 19th century, also in Africa and in Asia. Settler colonies have produced new vernacular, that is, languages of the home, and the new vernaculars cause language endangerment and loss, whereas trade and exploitation colonies have produced new lingua francas or expanded them into those lingua francas that already existed and made them more spread. Here is a map that also very interesting, because in the 15th century, England, Holland, and France were not in the picture of colonization yet. The maritime powers were, for Europeans, were the Portuguese first, and then later on toward the end of the 15th century, the Spaniards. And the Spaniards actually, because Castile was landlocked, they had to rely on the help of Christopher Columbus, a Venetian that worked for the monarchy of Castile. And the Portuguese established several settlements on the coast of Africa and in part of what is now on the eastern part of Brazil. They get the rest much later. And so we can represent the map of the world more or less this way. What is interesting also is that the Spaniards maintain their colonies. The Portuguese would lose many of the trade colonies to Holland, France, and England, starting in the 17th century, and things changed. So the Portuguese Empire actually shrank, keeping Brazil, but the bigger Brazil, and in the 19th century, they would maintain Angola and Mozambique, and of course the small islands in the Bight of Biafra and Cape Verde. And so these are the kinds of things that we have to remember. So the Portuguese at least had a head start of 150 years before the other Europeans, except for Spain. But what we see also is the difference between Brazil, where Portuguese is the vernacular and has driven many other languages to extension, indigenous languages, but languages of other colonies. But in Angola and in Mozambique, Portuguese functions only as a lingua franca for the elite, okay, or for people that have been to school. And you want to have an idea of all the colonies that the Portuguese had, just look at all the small squares on the coast of Africa all the way to Asia, and here the dots on the coast of Asia, all the way to Macau, okay, and to some extent also Japan, and these were trade colonies. Trade colonies are of a different nature. Europeans didn't try to subordinate the populations with which they traded. They formed alliances. And what we also noticed is that in this particular case, contrary to what we have always thought, there were no Portuguese pigeons that developed in these areas, but new varieties of pigeons, Portuguese, indigenized varieties of Portuguese emerged instead. And some of them produced Portuguese Creoles, such as in São Tomé and Príncipe, or in Cape Verde, and in Asia, also some of those Creoles, some Portuguese Creoles emerged in these places, such as the Creole of Macau, or the Papia Cristan in Malaysia. So these are interesting phenomena. But what we also see is that because of how they lost their colonies, the Creoles that emerged in Asia have been endangered. But the varieties that were spoken, that the Creole that emerged on the islands near the west coast of Africa, those ones have survived. What is the difference? These are the kinds of things that we have to try to understand, and we have to try to explain. So by the time we are in the 17th century, England, France, and Holland have joined Portugal and Spain in dividing different parts of the world. The Russians did it also in Siberia. And so we can speak of Anglophone world, Francophone world, Hispanophone world, Lusophone world, and Creolophone world. And when it comes to Anglophone, Francophone, Hispanophone, and Lusophone world, that's where we really have to be very careful, because we kind of overlook the indigenous languages that are spoken in the area, and what are the relations of coexistence, what are the dynamics of coexistence between the indigenous languages and the colonial languages brought by Europeans. So and so here, for instance, we look at what is known as the Anglophone world, which is the consequence of English colonization and later on British colonization. And the interesting thing to notice is, I'm having problems with my mouse now. In North America, for instance, English functions as vernacular. In Australia, too, English functions as a dominant vernacular. In South Africa, and to some extent Zimbabwe, English functions as a vernacular for a significant proportion of the population, but not even half. Whereas in Nigeria, what has become particularly important is Nigerian Pidgin English, also an offshoot of English, and in Sierra Leone, there is Creole and so forth. Whereas in India, and I have to get control of my mouth, in India and in places like Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, this is Zimbabwe, Zambia, and all the way to Kenya, we see English functioning only as a lingua franca. Okay. So again, in this part of the world, these are mostly exploitation colonies. India is one of those, and probably the biggest one. And in South Africa, we have an overlay of settlement colonization by the Dutch and exploitation colonization by the British. When we look into this, actually what we see is that we can better understand what is known as the Bantu dispersal, which is also a form of colonization, not so much in terms of empires and kingdoms, but in terms of the Bantu, proto-Bantu populations migrating into Central and Southern Africa, invading territories inhabited by the Pygmies and by the Khoi and San populations. And then little by little, the Pygmy populations died, and the Khoi and San populations, I'm sorry, not that the Pygmy population dies, the languages of the Pygmies died. Whereas in the area that used to be the Khoi and San territories, that most of the Khoi-San languages have died, but the populations are still there. What produced this, and we know it was not really the kind of colonization that the Europeans put in place in the Americas, but it is similar in the sense that the Bantu populations became dominant in all these areas. They set up their own political institutions at the expense of the political institutions of the Khoi and San people. But there is also an interesting phenomenon. The Bantu populations married into the Bantu populations married into the Khoi and San people. And that was one of the reasons why the Khoi and San languages disappeared, by cultural assimilation. Cultural assimilation is actually what has also happened in Latin America, for instance, where it is difficult to, I mean, the indigenous cultures are survived only in what may be considered like isolates now compared to the Indo-European populations. And one of the things that is remarkable in Latin America, at least based on my visits there, is the extent to which there has been genetic hybridization between the indigenous people and the European populations. It was as if by design, the Europeans wanted to create a kind of hybridization that would prevent indigenous populations from claiming their lands back. And the indigenous populations have become such small minorities that they don't have economic power or political power to fight back. And these are the kinds of things that we have to know. Whereas in the colonization of Africa, on the exploitation model since the 19th century, the end result is that the Bantu populations have remained overwhelming majority populations and could have fought back for independence. Whereas when people speak of independence in the Americas, for instance, this was the independence of Europeans from the metropolitan homes, but it was not the independence for the indigenous populations. And it took a long time before the descendants of Africans could partake in this kind of independence. And moreover, when people speak of post-colonies, it's easier to speak of political post-colonies about Africa and Asia, but it is really not obvious that we can speak of political post-colonies in the case of the Americas, because the rulers are, descendants of Europeans, although now they go for Brazilians or Mexicans and the like. Okay. And we can interpret all the trajectories, all the colonization ventures since the 15th century as one of the latest waves of the Indo-European dispersion. And the linguistic outcomes is that we get Creole language varieties that emerge. We also get other colonial dialects like Brazilian Portuguese, and the relationship between Brazilian Portuguese and Peninsula Portuguese in Europe is like the relationship between American English and British English, and the colonial varieties supported by more prosperous economies have become the dominant varieties that people shouldn't deride as if they were just colonial aberrations. Okay. And what also has happened with that latest wave of the European dispersal is migrations of different populations around the world from the new colonies. And so we can see, Asians in South America, and we can see Asians in Africa, we can see Asians in the Pacific, and they were all people that were taken everywhere for labor. And one of the reasons why the European languages, even if they didn't become Creoles, have changed so much is the context that these languages had with other European languages. And what is interesting, for instance, English becomes so dominant in North America, north of Mexico, whereas Portuguese becomes so prevalent in Brazil that it drove, for instance, Dutch out or English out and so forth. And these are interesting things. So it's in this context that I came up with the idea of feature pool in language, where the different features of different languages that came in contact got in competition with each other. And I illustrated that with the emergence of the varieties that we now call Creoles, which are the outcomes of language contact, language shift, and result and language speciation. And according to this map, if you pay attention, there is a complementary distribution between the varieties called pigeons and the variety called Creoles. It's a complementary distribution. When you put things in history, in historical perspective, you realize that the hypothesis that Creoles emerged from pigeon ancestors doesn't hold water. And my latest research actually shows that the pigeons themselves didn't emerge earlier than the Creoles. Generally, it looks like pigeons emerged later than Creoles, and we have to understand why. And for this, we have to revisit the way that the Portuguese set their settlement colonies. And I'm sorry, not the Portuguese set their trade colonies along the coast of Africa and the coast of Asia, what kinds of relations they had with the indigenous populations, and what were the languages of trade in the interior. And generally, it was not Portuguese. And when the English, the Dutch, and the French joined the Portuguese in trade colonization, for the longest, they used Portuguese as the language of trade on the coast only, but they communicated with interpreters or go-betweens. And it is the go-betweens that went into the interior, and they used the indigenous languages to trade with the interior and come back to the coast. And there was a lot of idling time on the coast that produced new populations known as mestizos, as mulattoes, and those are the people that really learn the European languages without Christianizing them. And at some point, when some of the colonies were lost, then the languages that emerged would become endangered. And these are the things that we really have to put in perspective. We have to remember that although we linguists came up with the hypothesis that European languages Christianized first, and then from Christianization, they became Creoles, nobody ever observed this. And my research actually suggests that Creoles evolved from gradual divergence from the lexifier. And the pigeons themselves too did the same thing, from population, varieties spoken by populations that learn the European languages more or less faithfully if that thing ever happens. But from closer approximation of European languages to more and more divergent approximations of European languages. I'm not going to get into detail because we are running out of time, but we can generally speak of the indigenization of European colonial languages in Africa and Asia. And I go farther than that. Once we use indigenization as adaptation of the language to its new users and to the new ecology in which it is used, then even Brazilian Portuguese went through indigenization, American English went through indigenization, and French in Canada, in Quebec, also went through indigenization. To be sure, this is true of the syncretization or hybridization of European and non-European cultures in settlement colonies, but only a small elite minorities of natives use the European languages as vernaculars in the exploitation colonies of Africa and Asia, where there is also less language endangerment and loss. And what we have to take from this as a tool for research is the notion of population structure. Because population structure exerts, tells you a whole lot about the dynamics of interaction. If there is a fracture like this, call it boundary, then there isn't much interaction. Then every population keeps the language. But if there is a lot of interaction, a whole lot of things happen. Then we have to look into power dynamics, not necessarily political, but also economic and so forth. And now to my last slide. Since the Second World War, there have been migrations back to Europe and some migrations within Africa, and now with wars everywhere around the world, there are all sorts of migrations. But the interesting thing is that Western Europeans are talking about a phenomenon called superdiversity. This is really a very biased term because we could have spoken of superdiversity when I showed the other map here earlier, when different populations from around the world were taken everywhere by Europeans to serve as laborers. Okay. And what is also happening is that the languages of the migrants are not dying that fast. One important reason is that pattern networks of telecommunication have changed. The migrants can keep contact with their homelands in their own languages, and therefore they can maintain their languages longer in the places where they have migrated. It's a form of colonization of some sort, but the form of colonization that consists of relocation and generally without significant political power. And although in the case of people coming from North America, we can speak of economic power and the languages are respected. So this is what I wanted to tell you about the role of migrations, population movements, language contacts, and how languages evolve differentially. And because I'm from the the global South, and bringing this perspective from the global South, you can see this as part of my contribution to decolonizing knowledge by inviting other scholars to develop, to consider alternative perspectives to account for language evolution around the world, and that is differential language evolution. I stop here, and I thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you.
Thank you, Professor Sally Coco. Thank you so much. I inform you that we are now open for questions. If you have any doubts, comments, or would like to share your ideas, please use the online chat. Então, pessoal, informo que nós estamos agora abertos para perguntas. Se vocês tiverem dúvidas, comentários ou desejarem compartilhar suas ideias, por favor, usem o chat online. Nós temos aqui um comentário muito interessante da professora Neuda. Opa, deixa eu só ir pela ordem, para não pular ninguém. Professor Sally Coco, our friend and Professor Neuda Lago has commented that indeed, throughout human history, populations have always colonized other people, but the outcomes diverge immensely. And Neuda also commented, Professor Mafuene, thank you for your inspiration lecture. Colonialism in any form had the detrimental effects on the colonized region and their population. And the question, considering the concept of choosing the lesser evil, which form of colonialism do you believe could be perceived as less aggressive? On the other hand, which form would you consider the most hostile? Question from Professor Neuda Lago.
Well, that's difficult. I cannot make a choice between different kinds of evils. What we have to deal with is what has happened in specific ecologies and how inhabitants of these ecologies have reacted to colonization. You know, we cannot just see colonization from the point of view of language vitality or language change. We should see colonization from a more global perspective. And this is something that has struck me. With colonization, for instance, several populations have had access to alternative forms of healthcare, of medicine. And in many cases, it's been for the better. The only problem is that the modern medicine was displacing indigenous medicinal practices. It shouldn't have displaced them. It's a matter of see how they can coexist and in what respects indigenous treatments are doing better than others. If you take it from the point of view of religion, it's interesting. There are particular religions that have spread widely, in particular Christianity and Islam. And they have this spread at the expense of indigenous religious practices very often. Okay. Is this a good thing? Is it a bad thing? It really depends. Now, if you treat all these things as technologies. Technologies are used to solve problems. And even languages are forms of technologies, as technologies for communication, by domestication of the human anatomy by the mind. Okay. And in some cases, people make free choices. They have to use this other language because it gives them some selective advantages over the competitors. But in some places, the shift has been a consequence of subjugation and oppression. And that's really a bad thing. But what we are also learning is that a whole lot of human life is based on economic activities. And the language that provides economic advantages tends to prevail. What we have to pay attention to is, if we don't want to give up our indigenous languages, what are the kinds of economic dynamics that we have to develop in order for our languages to compete with the colonial language? And that is something that is very important. You cannot just tell people, hey, you should continue speaking your mother tongue, because the person can ask you back, look, that guy is not speaking our heritage language, but they are doing better than us. So why shouldn't we shift to that language? And these are important questions to ask. So languages must be empowered. If you empower them economically and so forth, you give them a chance to survive. If you don't, then you reduce them to liabilities that people can leave behind. And we don't do this deliberately. We unfortunately, should I say unfortunately, but what happens is that when we shift, we are doing it on account of how many opportunities we have to operate in one language rather than another language. And then in this case, languages become like iron technology. Iron technology, if you don't use it, it rusts. And then at some point, it reaches a point where you cannot use it anymore. And these are the kinds of things that we have to bear in mind.
Thank you so much, Professor Salikoko. We have a lot of messages here from Professor Leonardo Dalla Rosa. Professor, thank you for the exceptional and enriching speech for your researches. Janaína Cardoso, thank you very much. Excellent lectures. Vilmar de Angelis, wonderful. Andresa, amazing. Belubia, thanks for the inspiring talk, Professor. Elisângela Souza, excellent lecture. Leonardo, okay. Thank you so much. So I think it's time. Dear colleagues and esteemed Professor Salikoko Mafuene, we have reached the end of the opening conference of the Second International Colloquium on Education for the Global South. On behalf of the entire organization team, I would like to express our heartfelt gratitude for your valuable participation on the inspiring lecture you shared with us. Your contribution was of utmost relevance and will resonate in our minds and academic practice as we strive to build a more inclusive and just space for knowledge and education. We also extend our thanks to all the participants for your presence and engagement in this colloquium. It is the diversity of ideas and perspectives that enriches our discussions and drives us to seek more comprehensive solutions for the challenges we face. Em Português now, nossos colegas, nós chegamos ao final da conferência de abertura do segundo colóquio de Educação Internacional para o Sul Global. Em nome de toda a equipe organizadora, gostaria de expressar nossa profunda gratidão pela valiosa participação do professor Salicoco e pela palestra inspiradora com que nos presenteou. A sua contribuição foi de extrema relevância e certamente irá reverberar em nossas mentes e nossas práticas acadêmicas, à medida que buscamos construir um espaço mais inclusivo e justo para o conhecimento e a educação. Agradecemos também a presença e o engajamento de todos os participantes neste colóquio. É a diversidade de ideias e perspectivas que enriquece nossos debates e nos impulsiona a buscar soluções mais abrangentes para os desafios que enfrentamos. E agora gostaria de informar que nós teremos um intervalo de 15 minutos para que todos possam descansar e recarregar as energias. E em seguida nós desfrutaremos de um momento cultural especial com apresentações de músicas brasileiras de diferentes regiões do Brasil, abrangendo variados tipos musicais. A gente sabe que a música é uma expressão poderosa da nossa cultura e identidade, e é com muita alegria que compartilharemos nesse momento com todos vocês. Mais uma vez, nossos sinceros agradecimentos ao professor Salicoco Mafuene e a todos os presentes nesse colóquio. Esperamos que este seja o início de uma jornada colaborativa em busca de uma educação transformadora e inclusiva para o Sul Global. Muito obrigada. Só para traduzir essa parte final, eu já encerro e passo a palavra à Tamara. Então, now I would like to inform you that we will have a 15 minutes break for everyone to rest and recharge. Following the break, we will enjoy a special cultural moment with Brazilian musical presentations and from different regions of Brazil, encompassing various musical styles. Music is a powerful expression of our culture and identity, and it is with great joy that we share this moment with all of you. Embrace this opportunity to connect even more deeply with the richness and the diversity of Brazilian music. Enjoy the break, relax, and come back refreshed to enjoy this exciting musical journey. Once again, our sincere thanks to Professor Salicoco Mafuene and to everyone present at this colloquium. We hope that this event is just the beginning of a collaborative journey and pursuit of transformative and inclusive education for the Global South. Thank you very much. Tamara?
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Paula. Some details, alguns detalhes técnicos. Agora, nós teremos, então, um intervalo com essa apresentação musical para vocês terem acesso à sala de apresentação musical e para a sala de roda de conversa. Vocês já fizeram o registro na página que a equipe AVE enviou o link, então é só vocês acessarem a página, clicar no link, a apresentação cultural, que vai abrir direto, e depois novamente acessar e clicar o ícone roda de conversa 1, que também vai abrir diretamente na roda de conversa, pois não serão transmitidas via YouTube, sim, serão salas fechadas somente aos participantes do evento. À tarde ocorrerá da mesma forma, vocês clicarão no GT que vocês participam para serem direcionadas à sala. Muito obrigado por tudo e tenham um bom intervalo musical.
Thank you, Tamara.
So, as a